Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Sean Powers from Linux Journal. Most of you already know me. Today we're actually hearing from Alanna Brown, who is the Senior Product Marketing Manager at Puppet Labs. She's going to give us a demonstration or give us a presentation on how to build high-performing IT teams using Puppet. So Alanna, I will hand it off to you. You should have control, and if you need anything, just holler.
Thanks, Sean. Good morning, everyone. My name's Alanna Brown. I have worked at Puppet Labs for the last 4 years, and I spearheaded our annual State of DevOps survey and report, which I hope at least some of you have read. And I've spent the last 4 years studying DevOps and high-performing teams. So if you're like most of the people I talk to, you're struggling with how to operationalize DevOps and implement it in a pragmatic and sustainable way. Based on data and real-world examples from customers in every stage of the DevOps journey, I'm going to share with you some of the keys to building a high-performing IT team. So today, I'm going to help you cut through the noise so you can start your DevOps initiative on the right foot. I'm going to demystify high performance and show you the 5 steps to kickstarting your initiative, supported by findings from our 2015 State of DevOps report. So the first and most critical step in kickstarting your DevOps initiative is building the case and creating consensus. And I know this sounds really simple, but most people actually get this critical step wrong. You can't just say, we're going to do DevOps now and expect everyone to drop everything and jump on board. How many of you have ever experienced a higher-up telling you that you had to go and implement the latest buzzword without fully understanding what that would entail? If you've experienced that, you know that it often doesn't work, and it's hard to get buy-in that way. There's a really fantastic talk by Simon Sinek, who wrote a book called Start With Why, among other best-selling books. And the basic premise is this: people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. You probably already know why DevOps matters, but that doesn't mean that the rest of your team, your peers, or the people you report to actually get it. So just as an experiment today, after this webinar, I want you to go ask 10 people, what problem are we trying to solve, and see what answers you get. I bet they'll be very different depending on who you talk to. If you're a manager or a team lead, listen up, because you play a critical role here. One of the most unexpected findings from the 2015 State of DevOps report was that when the DevOps initiative was driven purely from the top down or purely from a grassroots level, we actually saw a negative effect on organizational performance. That's why all of you managers and team leads are so important. You're the ones who connect the strategic goals of the business with the on-the-ground execution. And in the next couple of slides, I'm going to give you the tools to make a really strong business case for DevOps in your organizations. One of the biggest challenges every organization faces is the need to move faster without compromising the reliability, security, and stability of their systems. And these two seemingly opposing forces of agility and reliability, they actually are possible to achieve. And it's not just the unicorns like the Googles or the Amazons of the world who are achieving these results, it's the horses too. Over the past 3.5 years, 4 years, we've consistently found that high-performing IT organizations are more agile. They deploy code 30 times more frequently, and they deploy 200 times faster than their peers. We also know that the high-performing IT organizations are more reliable. When we compared our high-performing group this year to the high performers last year, we found that they were actually deploying at the same speed and frequency, but their overall stability was substantially better than the 2014 respondents. Our high performers this year have 60 times fewer failures, and they're able to restore service 168 times faster. So what this tells us is that organizations are shifting quality to the left, meaning quality is being built into the entire software development process, and they're seeing better outcomes as a result. If you think of the software delivery process as an assembly line, On the far left, you'd have the developer's laptop, where the code originates, and on the far right, you have your production environment, where that code ultimately ends up. Today, there is a lot of waste in that value stream, and the fact that stability is increasing suggests that orgs are improving the system as a whole. That quality isn't just the responsibility of one team, but the shared responsibility of everyone involved in the software delivery process. We also know that strong IT performance is a competitive advantage. So if you've been following the news, there's a couple of recent outages all on the same day at Wall Street Journal, the New York Stock Exchange, and United Airlines. And I think this really illustrates the point that every company is a technology company, and IT is critical to helping businesses achieve their goals. IT is no longer just a cost center. Companies with high-performing IT organizations are 1.5 times more likely to exceed profitability, market share, and productivity goals than their peers. And some of the preliminary financial analysis from our 2014 report also hints that it can even increase the total value of publicly traded companies as measured by market capitalization. I think this quote by Edward Deming sums it up the best. For those of you who aren't familiar with Deming, he's considered by many to be sort of the godfather of DevOps. So I've included a link to his 14 points, which has influenced some of the best thinking in DevOps today. So the point of DevOps isn't to automate all the things, although automation should definitely be one of the outcomes. The point of DevOps is to create a culture of continuous improvement, because only the organizations that can adapt and learn will ultimately survive and win in the market. So after you've gotten everyone on the same page about the problems you're trying to solve as an organization, you need to get everyone aligned on what the desired outcomes are so you have a clear understanding of what success looks like. As you all know, DevOps requires some big changes across the organization, changes that impact culture, processes, and people. At the organizational level, the desired outcomes are to create a culture of high trust with high-performing cross-functional teams that are all aligned around a common business goal. And to get to that place, a lot of processes have to change as you go from this very manual and siloed way of working to adopting greater levels of automation, abstraction, and learning how to collaborate with each other. And these process changes lead to shorter cycle times, higher productivity, and greater visibility. And I think first and foremost, DevOps is about people, and there's real human cost to all of the work that we do. Burnout is a really important issue in IT, and one that we researched in this year's report. The conditions that lead to burnout, unsustainable workloads, lack of control, and low-trust pathological cultures, they can be prevented. And not surprisingly, the data shows that where burnout is high, organizational culture is poor, deployment pain is high, and organizational performance is low. So just consider how many of you are actually struggling right now to hire tech talent. It's really hard, and it's a huge problem for most companies. Did you know that it can cost upwards of $20,000 to hire one engineer, not to mention all of the hidden and opportunity costs included in that? So consider this. What if instead of spending that money on hiring new engineers every time one gets fed up and quits, you spent that money on changing the work conditions that led to burnout and stagnation in the first place? In the next 2 slides, I'm going to show you what that investment looks like. So here's the good news. The desired outcomes that we just talked about, those are achievable. In the 2015 State of DevOps report, we found a direct link between DevOps practices, IT performance, and organizational performance. The diagram you see here is from the report, and it represents a statistical model that shows how the practices that make up continuous delivery, those include deployment automation, automated testing, continuous integration, and the use of version control for all production artifacts. These practices predict deployment pain, IT performance, and change fail rate. And in turn, IT performance predicts organizational performance. One of the new constructs we added this year was around lean management practices. And lean management practices include limiting work in process, the use of visual displays to monitor quality and productivity, and also the proactive use of monitoring for application and infrastructure. And this diagram shows how these lean management practices actually predict organizational culture, IT performance, and burnout. And while culture and IT performance both predict organizational performance, I think it's really important to point out here that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Lean manufacturing has evolved over 100 years, and there's so much we can learn from these battle-tested and codified principles and practices. When we apply these practices to software delivery, we get the same results: higher quality products, faster cycle times, and lower cost and waste. So doing DevOps doesn't mean you'll all be sitting around a campfire singing Kumbaya, right? DevOps transformation is hard work, and there will be plenty of challenges along the way. So one of our customers, Jonathan Fletcher from Hiscox, just a big insurance company in the UK, he led his organization through a DevOps transformation where he faced the epic challenge of driving change across a very large, very siloed organization. And you can read all about Jonathan's amazing story on our blog. I've included the link there. And I think the results really speak volumes. Hiscox was able to reduce the cost per release on one application by 97%. And by automating their testing suite, they reduced multiple days of manual effort to an overnight hands-free process. But their transformation did not happen overnight. It took a lot of evangelizing, rethinking, and restructuring. But before we talk about team structure, I want to first talk about one of the biggest challenges Hiscox face and one of the ones that you're most likely to face. So when I talk to customers about their challenges with adopting DevOps, they often cite resistance as change as their #1 barrier. But I would argue that the root cause isn't resistance to change, but rather the way people are incentivized to do their work. So the business is incentivized to deliver value to customers so it can generate more revenue. Dev teams are incentivized to deliver new features faster and faster. Ops teams are incentivized to keep the systems running at all costs. And quality teams are responsible for the quality of the software. These incentives are all different and therefore lead to very different behaviors. One of our longstanding customers, Rena Matthews, who's the principal architect in quality engineering at Salesforce, said something that really struck me. She said, at Salesforce, everyone is responsible for quality, and we're all trying to deliver the best solution for our customers. So for Salesforce, every single participant in the software delivery process is incentivized to improve the service their teams deliver to their customers. And again, I think the results really speak for themselves. Salesforce has been ranked the most innovative company by Forbes magazine for a record 4 consecutive years. And they also rank #7 on Fortune 100's best places to work with. Salesforce and Hiscox are both awesome examples of companies that are aligned around the goal of delivering value to customers. In order to achieve alignment, you have to be structured correctly in the first place, which we'll talk about in a minute. But first, I want to talk about another common objection you'll hear. So who here has tried to make the case for DevOps and heard this? We can't do DevOps because our application is fill in the blank. Well, we found in our 2015 report that it doesn't matter if your apps are greenfield, brownfield, or legacy. As long as they're architected for testability and deployability, high performance is possible. We found that high-performing respondents share some common architectural characteristics. They do most of their testing without requiring an integrated testing environment. They can deploy their applications independently of other dependent applications or services. and many of them happen to be using a microservices architecture. So just to illustrate this point, one of our customers has an app running on a mainframe with a 1 million-line code base, and they're doing automated testing against that code base. It's definitely not easy, but they're doing it. So the next time someone tells you we can't do DevOps because our application is running on a mainframe or whatever the excuse is, you can tell them they're wrong. One of the questions that we get asked all the time is, what is the ideal team structure for DevOps? And I think the answer really depends on a few variables, like how flexible is your current org structure, what skill sets do you currently have on your team, what's the relationship between your team and team leaders. So how many of you work in an org structure that looks something like this? This is pretty typical of large enterprise organizations, and what this results in and what we've seen is multiple silos of highly specialized individuals, which then leads to multiple handoffs to get changes into production. I was talking to the head of infrastructure at a large retailer, and he said it took 15 teams just to deploy one service. So think about this. If you count each handoff as a conservative 3 days to account for lead times, work in process, configuration errors, etc., that would be 45 days just to deploy that service, and the majority of that time is pure waste. So silos exist for a reason, and they do serve a purpose, but they also tend to hinder communication and collaboration. But since they're not going away anytime soon, how do we work around these existing silos? I'm going to show you the 3 common patterns we see that work really well for DevOps. So the first pattern is one in which Dev and Ops remain distinct teams, but they still work really closely together to deploy applications. And the goal is not to have Devs do operations and Ops do development. It's for each team to have an awareness and understanding of how their work impacts each other. Devs can teach Ops a lot about agile development practices, and Ops can help Devs understand how their apps will actually run in production. I think this pattern works really well for smaller organizations, but it's difficult to scale, so it's extremely important in this structure to have a common tool chain between Dev and Ops to facilitate really strong collaboration. The second pattern we see a lot with our large enterprise customers like Salesforce and Hiscox is they've had a lot of success implementing a cross-functional model. So cross-functional teams typically consist of representatives from all the disciplines responsible for developing and deploying a service. So that might include your business analysts, product owners, developers, quality engineers, ops, infosec, etc. And the most important thing is that these teams are fully empowered and self-sufficient. They write it, they test it, and they deploy it, and they monitor it. These teams are more efficient because there are less handoffs, and there are more opportunities for knowledge sharing. And then the third pattern we're seeing is the rise of the dedicated DevOps team. So in our 2014 study, actually 16% of respondents belonged to a DevOps department, and in 2015 that grew to 19%. Dedicated DevOps teams are often made of very experienced operations people with a mix of skills, including, they can use version control, they've written infrastructure as code, they've maybe dabbled in continuous delivery, and they often exist to address a very specific pain point such as deployment automation, but often grow to become much more than that. So one of the pitfalls of a dedicated DevOps team is that it can become just another silo. In order to prevent that from happening, it's critical that these teams evolve to providing shared services for the rest of the organization, and also providing coaching, training, and support to evangelize DevOps best practices. I think this structure is best for orgs where the deployments are extremely painful, they need quick results, and they have all the necessary skills in-house, but maybe they can't get all the necessary buy-in from higher levels up in the organization. What we tend to see in more mature DevOps organizations is a hybrid approach. There's typically a small team responsible for providing self-service platforms, and also several product-focused teams that tend to own the end-to-end delivery of a product or service. So another question we get asked a lot is, what are the roles and responsibilities of team members in a DevOps implementation? If you're an IT manager or a team lead, I highly recommend checking out the 2015 State of DevOps report, because there's a whole section in there for how IT managers can help their teams win. So the main thing to remember if you're a manager, whether you're on the dev side, ops side, or marketing, or whatever, is your primary focus is to remove roadblocks for your team by building trust with your counterparts so that everyone can work more effectively together. And earlier I talked about lean management practices and how they contribute to IT performance. If you want to increase the performance of your team, the answer isn't to pile on more work, but actually to limit work in process so people can complete the work they have. Additionally, providing visible metrics that show flow and quality are great ways to keep everyone on track. And if you're a practitioner, you're not off the hook. You also have to learn how to collaborate with your counterparts on other teams, because trust is one of the most important factors for both IT and organizational performance. If you're in ops, most of your initial work will be automating away the pain points so you can get to a place where you're no longer constantly fighting fires. So for all of you out there, focus on the quick wins to start and then share your successes out. And if there are any QA and QE folks in the room, you have a lot to teach us about building quality into everything we do. So I'd recommend everyone here reaching out to those QA and QE folks in their org. And devs, one of the things that you can do to really help out is to talk to ops early and often as you're planning your deployments. So next we're going to talk about some technical practices and DevOps tool chain. And I know people get really grumpy when you start talking about DevOps tools. And you've all heard people emphatically say DevOps is about culture, not tools. I agree with that statement 100%. But I also believe that tools can drive behavioral change. And ultimately, it's our behaviors that become part of the culture and reinforce the culture. So just to illustrate this point, how many of you at some point in the last 10 years moved away from email to a ticketing system? Did your behavior change as a result? Did it force you to think about ownership and priority, and also how to provide the right level of detail and information so your ticket actually gets handled? I know I've had that experience. And for those of you working in agile organizations, you know that Kanban itself doesn't make you agile, but it does help you rethink your flow of work and understand bottlenecks better. So we know that tools can reinforce culture and change and drive behavioral change. And we know that the practices that these tools enable are highly correlated with IT performance. So this is just a short list of some of the more common tools you'll find in a DevOps tool chain, which consists typically of a distributed version control system, configuration management, continuous integration, and deployment and monitoring tools. And of course, there are a lot of other tools in this ecosystem as well. But here's some considerations as you're building your tool chain. First, standardize on the tool chain and make sure that each tool you choose is compatible with the rest of the tools in your tool chain. Second, where possible, try to use the same tools your devs are using. Are they already invested in GitHub and Jenkins? Then those are probably the best choices for your team if you want to promote better cross-collaboration. You can do things like set up lunch and learns with them, leverage their expertise, and this will help to build that trust between the teams. If you're starting from scratch, then I recommend starting on the left with version control and configuration management, and then working your way towards the right. Figure out what the smallest thing you can do is and then build on it, whether that means simply getting all of your scripts under version control or writing a manifest for a basic OS configuration. So 1-800-Flowers is another big customer of ours, and they started by standardizing all of their configurations for their PCI requirements. And I realize that's no small feat, But they were able to start small by standardizing configurations for each of the necessary components, such as NTP, firewall, user permissions, etc., until at some point they had completed all of their PCI requirements. So infrastructure as code is necessary for many DevOps practices, but I would say that it's not entirely sufficient on its own. When you combine the practice of infrastructure as code with version control, you get this amazing force multiplier effect. This is where ops teams can learn a ton from devs. With infrastructure as code, you can apply proven agile development best practices to your infrastructure code. So things like code review, automated testing, and continuous delivery are now possible for your system configuration code, making your teams more agile and your systems more reliable. And together, these practices enable fast feedback loops, the ability to iterate quickly, greater collaboration between dev and ops teams because you're all using the same tools and similar processes, and also greater visibility into infrastructure changes. And these are the things we see as really key to becoming an agile, lean organization that continuously learns and improves. When we analyzed the data from the State of DevOps survey, we found that the use of version control was highly correlated with all of our IT performance metrics. So deployment frequency, lead time for changes, and mean time to recover. With your infrastructure code in a version control system, you can quickly produce environments for testing and troubleshooting, and that increases your deployment frequency and reduces your lead time for changes. It also allows you to quickly identify any cause of failure and roll back to the last known good state, which significantly reduces your mean time to recover. Peer review is, I think, one of the biggest benefits of a distributed version control system, and this is why. The data tells us that the traditional way of controlling change via a change approval board is highly ineffective. When external approval is required to deploy to production, IT performance decreases, and contrary to popular belief, change approval boards have very little impact on stability. But when the technical team holds itself accountable for the quality of its code through peer review, we saw that performance increases. In a peer review process, code can be contributed by anyone, dev, ops, quality engineers, infosec, etc., and it can be reviewed by anyone, and you can work on it as a team. One of the most awesome benefits of having your infrastructure as code is that you can do continuous delivery to make sure each change to your infrastructure is fully tested before it hits production. And this is important because it, A, forces your team to work incrementally in small batches, making it easier to fix and detect errors as they occur. And it also enables fast feedback loops, which is a common theme across the DevOps toolchain. Tools like Puppet have these continuous delivery workflows built into them so you can easily manage and promote your code across your environments. As you start your DevOps initiative, you also want to think about how you measure success. There are a lot of different metrics you can look at, but we suggest that you start with some simple metrics for throughput and stability. And my favorite new construct from this year's report is deployment pain. We found that deployment pain is highly correlated with IT performance. The more painful your code deployments are, the poorer your organization's IT performance, overall performance, and culture. And the reason I love this so much is because it gives us a really quick temperature gauge to assess our IT performance. So tomorrow, as homework, I want everyone to ask their teams 2 questions. First, how painful are your deployments? And then I want you to follow up with what are the things causing the pain? And then I want you to actively work to prioritize and fix those pain points. One of the things I'm most proud about this year is our section on women in tech. There's a whole body of research out there that shows that teams with more women have higher collective intelligence and achieve better business outcomes. But despite that, women are leaving STEM fields at alarming rates. In our survey, only 5% of survey respondents were women, and more than half of the survey respondents work on teams that are less than 10% female. and a third of our survey respondents said they worked on teams with no women whatsoever. I think we can all do better, and it's up to us to make IT better for everyone. So that leads us into the Q&A. Sean, do you have any questions?
Yes, absolutely. Sorry, we've had a couple come in here. Can you hear me? I wanted to make sure that I'm still online.
Yep.
We have, so here's the first question. What makes Puppet different from other automation tools?
That's a great question, and Puppet, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is an IT automation solution, and it's declarative and model-driven, which makes it different from other tools out there. So by declarative, what I mean is you declare the desired end state of your infrastructure, and Puppet makes it so. So you don't have to know all the steps in between to make it so. Puppet understands what those steps are and then enforces your desired end state. And that means, and what model-driven means is that Puppet actually knows everything about your infrastructure before it does anything. And because it's model-driven, it allows you to simulate your changes before you make any changes in production and track those changes over time. And one of the coolest new features we added to our last release is the node graph, which allows you to visualize your infrastructure and the dependencies in your infrastructure and with these really cool graphs that you can interact with.
All right, so we have another one here. How does Puppet enable a DevOps way of working?
That's a great question. As I mentioned earlier, infrastructure as code is a foundational practice because it enables other key DevOps practices, including automated testing, deployments, and continuous integration. And as we found, these practices predict IT performance. So across the DevOps tool chain, I would say that there are two common characteristics for these tools. One, they promote better collaboration across teams, and two, they enable fast feedback loops. So the way Puppet does this is we have a very commonly used language that's used by tens of thousands of users. It's the Puppet DSL, and it's so simple and powerful that really anyone can use it and contribute to it. So it can bridge that gap between Dev, Ops, InfoSec, et cetera. Like if you're following the CAMS model, which is culture, automation, measurement, and sharing, automation is one of the enablers for a high-trust organization because you're not relying on faulty manual processes, and you can actually have trust in the automated processes you put forward. And then as far as measurement goes, Puppet offers some really rich reporting capabilities, so you can see exactly what's changed in your infrastructure and by whom. And then for sharing, the Puppet code itself is easily shareable, and we have the Puppet Forge, which is a repository of almost 3,000 modules that's shared by community members and Puppet Labs employees, so you can share the work that you've done and benefit the rest of the community.
All right, here's another one. Do you have recommendations for how to create a DevOps team or how to grow an existing one?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say look in-house first because you probably have the necessary skills in-house. So I would look for those pockets of automation or the teams that are currently offering the self-service tools. Look for things that are functioning really well and pull a few people from those teams. The problem and one of the pitfalls is that it's usually the most capable people who are often the busiest and have the highest workload, so you need to be sensitive to that. But look for those system engineers that are doing amazing work and see what you can learn from them. I would also suggest, like, if you're initiating a new project or you have a really important product that you're trying to improve the delivery of, pulling together a cross-functional team and starting to bridge the gap across those teams, that's worked really well for a lot of our large enterprise organizations.
Okay, and we actually do have one last question here. It kind of goes along with the last question. What advice do you have for a manager of a traditional operations app support team with a company that will be rolling out DevOps? What training and et cetera would you suggest to best position the team and the manager?
So for a traditional, could you repeat that first bit?
Yes, so it says, what advice do you have for a manager of a traditional operations app support team with a company that will be rolling out DevOps? What sort of training, et cetera, would you suggest to position the team and the manager?
Yeah, you know, I would recommend a few resources, and you know, I should have gone to that slide earlier, but definitely the State of DevOps report has a lot of information for IT managers and how to help them win. I think the Phoenix Project by Gene Kim, who's a good friend of mine, is also a great resource if you want to talk about culture. But you know, ultimately DevOps is about culture and organizational change, and I think like for a manager, managers are so critical in this process and they're often overlooked. But I would start by reaching out to your counterparts and understanding their needs, and then making sure that you can translate the goals of the business to your team and understand how the work that they're executing on actually achieves those goals and be able to translate those up as well. And then finally, I think measurement is super important. So those metrics I showed earlier, I would start tracking those, and the most important thing with metrics is they don't do anyone good if they're not shared. So make sure that you're sharing those successes up. As far as training goes, like depending on what tools you're adopting, I would achieve some level of familiarity with them and see if you can seek out training courses from those vendors. I think if you're just starting on the continuous delivery journey, the Continuous Delivery by Jez Humble is an awesome book, and he's a great resource too. And he has another book out called Lean Enterprise, which is great. Oh, and also, 2 conferences. Go to PuppetConf 2015. It's a great conference. We're going to have an IT leader track there where we talk about sharing DevOps best practices. And DevOps Enterprise Summit, you can find all those videos online. Also a great resource.
All right. I know I said that was the last question, but one just came in that actually I think you'll want to speak to because it's a really common question that people have. Is Puppet suitable for someone who is a newcomer to DevOps, or is it just for the experienced user?
I mean, we have a lot of people who are brand new to Puppet who adopt it over time. I would say that any tool requires some learning curve, but, you know, the gains that you get from automating far outweigh the time it takes to learn. So, like, by starting that journey now, you'll be well positioned for all the future things that you're going to have to deal with, all the future changes, because the one thing we know is that things are constantly changing in technology. So if you have automation in place now, you'll be in a better position for the future.
All right, perfect. Thank you. I just wanted to dispel the myth that DevOps is only for people who already know how to do DevOps, because that's just silly. Thank you so much, Alanna. It was wonderful, informative. Thank you, everybody else, for attending. We appreciate it. I want to remind everybody that this entire webinar will be available on the Linux Journal website. So if you want to watch it again, want to recommend other people to watch it, that's awesome. So thank you to the attendees. Thank you again, Alanna, and everybody have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, everybody.